Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this important conversation about why we can't end men's violence against women without community-led approaches. My name is Brad Chilcott. I'm the Executive Director of White Ribbon Australia, and I'm coming to you from what is and always will be the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, now known as Brisbane. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future of these lands, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us from many lands across this country. It's essential we remember that the privilege that many of us enjoy came at great cost to others, that sovereignty was never ceded, and that injustice continues to this day, and that First Peoples are disproportionately impacted by the issues that we're going to discuss tonight. So we collectively commit to walking with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a spirit of harmony towards a future where all people have equal opportunity to belong, contribute and thrive in this society. I'm with Hala Abdelnour tonight, the CEO and founder of the Institute of Non-Violence.
Thank you, Brad. It's a pleasure to co-present this webinar with you this evening, and I appreciate the collective commitment we're making to walk in harmony with our First Nations people. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations, and I pay my respects to the elders of this land and the lands that everyone is joining us from tonight. And I acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today and pay my respects to your elders. So as the CEO and founder of the Institute of Non-Violence, I'll give a quick introduction. We launched in November last year on the International Day to Eliminate Violence Against Women. So we're pretty young. We work with government, not-for-profits and the wider community to improve family violence response. Our work is focused primarily on applying an intersectional feminist framework to address some of the gaps that we see in services, particularly to multicultural communities, members of the LGBTI communities, and others who find themselves on society's margins. We do this by consulting with governments and organizations across Australia. We design and deliver professional training. We design and review behavior change programs. We offer clinical supervision to practitioners who work with people who use family violence, and a range of social advocacy initiatives and collaborations. I'll leave it there. There's an introduction. Brad, I'm very excited to welcome our guest speakers and co-host with you tonight. We are going to introduce our speakers to everyone shortly, but at the moment I'm going to hand it back to you, Brad, for some housekeeping.
So we've got more than 600 people registered tonight. There's about 170 or 180 already with us. And we've got the chat function on. And so you'll see Alan from White Ribbon Australia commenting in there and responding to some of your questions, and also letting Hala and I know what's going on. Bryony from White Ribbon Australia is our tech moderator and can respond to any of your tech questions you might have. And if you're there on Facebook, you'll see Nicole maybe answering some of your questions on the Facebook live stream. But we should let you know that we'll exclude anyone who isn't helping us create a safe space, and we won't tolerate any misogyny, racism, homophobia or transphobia at all. It's also a conversation about eliminating all forms of men's violence and abuse against women. We know that there's other forms of violence that occur and shouldn't, but that's not what this conversation's about. So please respect that. In other words, don't be an MRA, please, tonight. And if you do, we'll have to remove your ability to contribute to the chat. And if things get too wild in the chat, we'll simply turn it off, but I'm hoping we don't need to do that. This conversation may also raise traumatic experiences for some of us listening. We've got some phone numbers up in the chat for you to call if you need someone to speak to for support. We're also here to not only explore the issues, but more importantly, to commit to meaningful action. It's not enough for us to know that men's violence is bad, but we need to be reflecting on our own role in creating the change we need in order to build a future where women are safe from men's violence. In particular, we want to talk about what effective community-led responses to men's violence looks like, how to be a good ally and how to partner with communities, and to understand more about the importance of self-determination. White Ribbon Australia's new model of community action groups and our Community Response Fund, which is designed to resource community-led prevention work, both sound like good ideas, but what is going to make it work, and to not replicate the mistakes of patriarchy and colonialism?
That's awesome. Thanks, Brad. And just want to flag too, as we get on to the conversation, that we are going to be using the term cultural and culture quite broadly tonight to denote any subculture that someone may identify with. And we acknowledge that our panel members focus, some of our panel members focus maybe ethnicity-based cultural identity. So let's meet our panelists and invite them to introduce their work to us. So we will read each bio one at a time and invite you to tell us about the work you do, how you do it, why you do it, and what makes it essential to your target community. We're going to start with Alan Thorpe, who has 25 years experience working with the Aboriginal community in Victoria, and since 2004 has been funded by the Victorian government to deliver approximately 20 leadership programs to vulnerable Aboriginal men. Alan, tell us about the work you do, how you do it, why you do it, and what makes it essential to your community.
Yeah, thanks, Hala. Good evening, everybody. And I'll just start that I want to acknowledge the traditional owners that I'm meeting on tonight, where I am, located in Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. I'm a Gunai man, so my ancestors and my family, my mob from Gunai country, which is east of Melbourne, which is in Gippsland. And so I'm really proud of who I am and proud of my heritage. And I always have been, to tell you the truth, even though I'm a fair-skinned Aboriginal man, but I feel really strong about my identity and feel it's really in my DNA. And, I've been really lucky because I've grown up in Melbourne, I've grown up around, the gathering place in Fitzroy where everyone really reunited. A lot of families, Archie Roach sings a song a lot about Charcoal Lane, and so it really brought our community back together. And so, I suppose I've always worked in the Aboriginal community, and I've worked in several roles in drug and alcohol and other community services, but I've really enjoyed the journey working with men and restoring roles and supporting men in their journeys and their healing. And been doing that for a while. I've worked and I've learned a lot, and I'm enjoying doing some of the preventative work with young men too. I sort of spent some time in Parkville and really sort of try and guide them young men back into, get the support, wrap the support around them and the role models that they deserve, So I'm fascinated and curious about how we do things and learning. So that's been a good journey too. So and just being innovative, and really trying different things and really, I'll talk a little bit about the results we get, but it's actually working, and it's because we're leading it, and with particularly in the early days with a lack of support, but that's turned around a little bit. So I just want to acknowledge all the rest of the panelists and acknowledge everyone who's joined us tonight, and hopefully we'll have a good night and good yarn. So I'll just check in with that.
Thanks, Alan. It's such a privilege for us to have you with us tonight, and can't wait to hear more about your work. Up next, we have Elizabeth Lang, who is the CEO and founder of Diversity Focus. Her areas of expertise include intersectional diversity and inclusion, domestic and family violence, and human rights. She's completing a PhD at Curtin University, and her thesis, Conceptualizing Domestic and Family Violence in the Frame of Collectivist Cultures, seeks to broaden the current conceptual understanding of domestic and family violence that has dominated research and practice discourse since the 1980s. So Elizabeth, please tell us a little bit about what you do, why you do it, and why it's so important to your target communities.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me tonight. I just want to also acknowledge that I'm living and working in the Whadjuk country of the Noongar Nation. So I'd like to acknowledge my traditional local elders here, and also pass this respect to anyone in our midst who might be of Aboriginal heritage tonight as well. And thank you, Alan, as well. So my area is really in the diversity and inclusion space. So you've had a bit there in my bio in terms of what I do. So in terms of the work with diversity focus, looking at diversity and inclusion, primarily through the lens of race, ethnicity, and culture. And that was a very purposeful decision. I do it because I believe that there's a need to address racial inequity in Australia. I believe that it's rampant in workplaces. And I also see that a lot of organizations and companies lack the confidence or the skills and to be able to address that. So that's why I do what I do. So it's work that is very soul nourishing in many ways. I guess in terms of my PhD as well, we also do a bit of training on domestic and family violence through sort of a culturally diverse lens in terms of looking at collectivist cultures. And I believe it's really important work because a lot of our interventions in Australia, and I guess I would argue to a large degree, you know, even in similar Western context, are kind of that are held as, you know, universal, are not really universal in that they don't speak to all groups, etc. And a part of what I'll be talking on later tonight will be addressing a bit of that. So I believe that interventions need to be contextual. They need to be specifically responsive to the communities that we're engaging. Otherwise, we simply don't create a change. And that's what has really led me to the research. So it is practice-led research that I'm very passionate about. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Dr. Tracy Castellino has been working to challenge and eliminate injustice and inequality for over 20 years. She has a passion for seeking respectful and innovative ways of working with individuals, organizations, and communities to respond to the various issues that cause marginalization and vulnerability. Through Shanti Works, Tracy and her team work to create a reflective, educative space as a way to explore key issues such as domestic violence, whiteness, and racism, and responding to trauma. Over to you, Tracy.
Wasn't prepared with the mute, sorry. I begin by acknowledging that I live and work from the location of a settler on the territories of the Wurundjeri peoples. I'm a woman of colour, a migrant, and have experienced the destroying and painful impacts of colonisation in my home country, India. However, I acknowledge that settlers like myself are responsible for the oppression Indigenous peoples have suffered and continue to suffer. I acknowledge Aboriginal elders past and present, Aboriginal colleagues here today. Because our systems of learning privilege dominant Western knowledge and our relationships are saturated in power relations, it is critical to always contextualise our work and locate ourselves. So linked to exactly what Elizabeth was saying, so really looking forward to connecting. I and we as a team at Shani Works do this work because we want for gender and racial justice. And justice in an unjust world requires change, and change requires disruption. Change is not always joyful or easy. It requires awareness of our own power and agency, as well as our learning edges. It involves discomfort, tensions, deep and dark challenges. It demands new interactions where we see other people's realities. In this instance, women who have been and who are subjected to men's violence against women. So I wanted to share a couple of stories just to show the passion and our commitment in the work and why it matters. In the early 1990s, in an inner city Melbourne, a handful of men, my male partner included, sat at our kitchen table and cut and sewed up white ribbons. They put pins in them and made cards with messages that took stands against men's violating women. All the while they talked, they shared food together, they tried to work out how to be better men in their world, their relationships, their communities. Now this was clunky and unsettling at times. There were mistakes and learnings, but there was a commitment to the ethics and the processes of men's role in challenging men's silence. The kitchen table activism by a small group of men in Melbourne started because of another small group of men from Ontario and Montreal who felt the enormity of the massacre of women in 1989. massacred simply because they were women. These men watched the devastating impact of the misogyny and the hatred of women in their community. And again, a small group of men grappled with the issue locally and decided to challenge men's silence on men's violence against women. So then men's violence against women's groups grew and connected across the world to do something. The White Ribbon campaign came from a few men trying to do something for their communities, for women to live safely and happily in their communities. So then in 2009, in December, I went to Montreal, to the L'École Polytechnique, known for the Montreal massacre. 20 years after, the trauma was still in the walls, in the air at the university, in the gravity of the conference we spoke at. But local resistance, disruption, collective care and solidarity were also present. Women led and men joined. Men's role and influence was essential. However, women's experiences and voices are critical and fundamental. They should not be marginalised in any movement, in any community efforts to eliminate men's violence against women. White Ribbon matters to me. It matters at the personal level, it matters at the political levels, and it matters for our community. But any effort is not okay. Community movements work when they are community designed, own, and hold dear the voices of those subjected to the injustices and harm. At times, White Ribbon efforts have lost their way and then found and worked together with community to re-establish themselves. I'm aware of the time. I wanted to just add a few more points if that's okay, and I just wanted to check you.
Of course, yeah.
So I just wanted to cover a few of the points for me with community-led approaches, and part of that is becoming familiar with the community you are seeking to serve and work with, and they are your source of knowledge. Identify and recruit community members, men and women, and build in accountability mechanisms. It is not a level playing field. Collective and dialogical education, just like Alan was speaking about, is fundamental to transformation, learning together. Regular and committed reflection, personally and collectively, about men's learnings and experiences and their accountabilities to the women their projects espouse to serve. And then finally, making sure that the systemic, policy and resource aspects of the transformative process is purposefully connected to the project's main purpose, main mission, and the women they're seeking to support. So that's a little bit about why this matters to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tracy. That was fantastic. What a great review of where White Ribbon came from, and a great vision for what it can be at its best as well. And we really hope that we do that listening and learning, and then putting that into practice really authentically, as you have described. That was fantastic. Lastly, we have Shayna Blaze, an award-winning interior designer, author, creative director, producer, and TV personality with us. She's best known for her role on The Block and Selling Houses Australia. Shayna is a passionate advocate for women and a social justice campaigner. She founded Voice of Change Australia, which uses the arts to unite domestic violence bodies on a single platform to invoke change with one cohesive voice. Shayna, please tell us a bit more about what you do, why it's so important for your target community, the arts community, to get involved in this work. Thanks. Ooh, are you on mute? You are on mute, Shayna. You're on mute, Shayna.
I'm trying to unmute it.
There we go.
It was saying it wouldn't let me. Thank you so much. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional landowners that I'm on with the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank you so much for including me in this. I am by no means an expert, as much as you all are, in family and domestic violence. My charity Voice of Change is very new, like yours, Hala. We only started last year, but really are only active now this year. And the reason we came about this is that we were making a movie about family violence, which is actually Australian premiere this weekend at Cinefest in Perth. And it was through the filming process and through the communication of the movie and what we were talking about that we realised how powerful the arts is, and telling stories is the best way of communication. And also when we were doing our research of when the movie was released, of how we were going to get our message across and really sort of be responsible for the message that we're putting out there, we realised that there's so many different groups out there doing great things, but people that in the general public not knowing how they can access it, what they can do. And voice of change means that, you know, we need to be collectively together having the same message, not having one group saying one thing, another group saying another, and then losing people. So what we're doing is using, as an example, our first project with the movie The Fort, and breaking down all the elements that are in that movie of different types of violence. As you were saying, it's not always just physical, and also the people within that. You know, you have a mother, you have a son, you have the husband, you have the family, how they all react and what they do is completely different. And so we want to take those stories to not just general communities, but to workplace, to schools, and use the tool of education through the arts and sort of, you know, break down the barriers of people thinking that it doesn't relate to them, how they can talk about it, what they can do, but using the arts as that initial communication school, whether it's through film, whether it's through music, through art, and opening the stories to coerce people in to actually start speaking up.
Thank you so much, and thanks. It's been great to hear from all of our panelists so far, and we can see that everyone has such a diverse range of experiences and knowledge and focus. It's going to be a really great conversation. So our first question for the whole panel, and anyone who is the most keen can jump in to answer this one. We recognise that men's violence isn't unique to any community, but that the solutions or how we prevent men's violence most likely are unique to each community. Communities with common identities and shared experiences know how to solve the problems they themselves face. Why is it important to recognise this when organisations like ours or like the Institute of Non-Violence have this big vision to fix men's violence or to create non-violence in our society? Why is it so important to recognise this reality? Who wants to go first? Oh, come on.
I'll jump in on one.
Okay, great.
I think my simple way I can explain that is that, you know, all different cultures have their experiences and how they approach their communication. And the easiest way I can say it is from the industry that I work in. You know, if you're building a house, you have a plumber, you take the information from that expert. If you have electrics, you take the electrician, their experts, and painters. So you can't build a house without the experts, and you can't build a community without all the experts that come in within those different areas. So I think it's really important that if you want proper advice from people, you go to those separate areas, you go to the communities, what works in those areas. You can't take something from one community and say it works there and it's going to work in the other. Just as the same, like a plumber, you want him to fix your electrics, it's not going to work. And that's the simplest way I can explain it from my life and what we're doing in communication, is that I'm not an expert in the field, so I'm gathering information from experts. And you can only make change when people from those areas, because people from those areas will listen to them. They're not going to listen to me.
Thanks. Tracy, I think you're ready to go.
Yeah, I was going to give it a shot because I think it's a big question.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of a particular example as Shana was talking, and I remember doing an evaluation of the help cards that we developed in domestic violence services, and particularly in the northern region where Alan is from and located at the moment. And we developed a whole lot of help cards for women who have been subject to domestic violence. And one of the ideas we had as a group, as a community sector, was make them in multiple languages. So we, you know, translated them into 13 different languages. And we thought it was incredible that we had them in languages and we'd taken care of it and we were handing them out. And we realised women weren't using them, right? Because we'd spent the time thinking about what we thought they needed, and what we'd done was limit it to we just translate. We translate an issue into a language, and we hadn't worked out any communication care. We hadn't worked out how to speak with women, how to share the information, how to use the card, what to do with it. So in the evaluation, we found most women from the 13 language communities that we translated in didn't use them. And we actually needed to train the white workers, and it was predominantly white workers, you know, what to do, how to take care in speaking with, in sharing the ideas, in working out what might be useful to women from communities who were marginalised and didn't have the dominant language, you know, or the expected.
Thanks. Elizabeth or Alan, want to jump in?
Alan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, it's good listening, and yeah, I just probably deep listening. I forgot the question.
So men's violence isn't unique to any community, but the solutions are. How we prevent men's violence in different communities requires a different approach. So understanding that communities with common identities, shared experiences, know the solutions to their own problems rather than someone else coming in and imposing solutions. Why is that important? Why is that important to the communities you work with?
I reckon you answered the question at the same time, Brad.
Yeah, right.
But I reckon, yeah, no, I've just like, it's absolutely true. You know, I think when you own it and, you know, looking at the answers and solution within communities and it really, I'm a big believer it does work, and you get better results when you can own it and you can develop it. Because I'm thinking for my mom and for the men I work with, you're backtracking all the time, you know, you're sort of going back into the deep oppressive colonisation. You know, you've got to deal and all that pain and all that hurt and that suppressive stuff over many years. That's why I love the healing and the transformation, because, you know, the violence and the educative part's a good part, but there's a real deep wound and a deeper, there's a real deepness to heal and, you know, make it, you know, because generations of trauma and that's why I feel that works for us, because if we can go to them places and heal a lot of that stuff, we have better outcomes and we have better, you know, we have better conversations. You just see transformation and change, and then it connects you back to culture, and it connects you to things that you've probably been suppressed and disconnected from. So, you know, I can only talk from my experience and what's worked for me personally and what's working for our cohort and our men we work with. So that you know, that ownership and looking at models and having elders involved and having, you know, restoring roles back, it's a really amazing thing, you know, and yeah, it's a great it's a great, I could talk about this stuff all night, but
well, we're going to
need to talk about it. I mean, I realise I've got other, but I'll just leave it there and maybe come back to some other stuff later.
Fantastic, thanks. Elizabeth, you got any thoughts to add on this one?
Yeah, just briefly. I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about domestic and family violence, we know that it is a universal issue that cuts across all, you know, groups, regardless of race, ethnicity, culture, religion, etc. Right? But I think it's important to also realize and acknowledge that the conditions that allow men's violence against women to flourish, they vary from one group to the next. And so in order to really create sustainable and more responsive approaches that actually deal with the problem, you have to come up with approaches. They have to be community-led. You can't, and I've seen it, it's happened many times. I've seen, you know, with very good intentions, well-meaning organizations transplanting ideas from one community to the next. And I think Shayna's example speaks to that so much. You can't just take one thing and put it over there and say it'll work, because yes, the problem might be the same, but it manifests differently across different groups. And in order to create a solution, the solution has to specifically speak to that problem. And I think that's a part of the challenge, because I think there's still a dominant narrative around this is what domestic and family violence is, and this is how we deal with it. And it's a very white heteronormative approach. And that doesn't work for a lot of community groups. It doesn't work for a lot of white community groups, I'll put it that way, let alone, other, culturally diverse communities as well. So I think that's one of the first biggest challenges.
Yeah, I think just continuing the conversation from that, it moves us into a new concept. I mean, it's new to me. I don't know how long self-determination's been talked about, but I'm happy to hear it more often. These days, I've spent a lot of my career being one of very few, if not the only bicultural worker in a lot of organizations. And I've experienced what it's like where, oh, Hala, someone's come in from whatever country, it's assumed I can speak their language, or I should be the one to deal with it because I'm from another country, that I wasn't born here, or I'm from non-Anglo heritage. And for a long time, subconsciously applying different practices. And I remember becoming consciously aware that, hey, I'm actually communicating differently in certain contexts when I'm working with my own community or with people from various different backgrounds. So I get excited that we start talking about self-determination and communities coming together and actually consciously making decisions about how we do this work. So could the panelists say a bit more about what is self-determination in practice, and why is understanding it essential to this work?
Oh, can I just say, Hala, I think for me, self-determination, and I think about sovereignty as well, it sort of goes hand in hand. But I mean, I just want to touch briefly on my experience around self-determination. Is I grew up as a 6-year-old boy in streets of Gertrude Street, where a lot of the community gathered, and we had absolutely no services. There was no support, but people sleeping in the laneways, people sleeping in the parks. But I'll tell you what, the unity and the care for each other was just incredible. People would come from who have been part of stolen generation, come and reunite with their families. So it was a place of gathering. And self-determination, it doesn't come from the intellect, it comes from spirit. And there's a sense of freedom, and there's a real deep meaning. When you know you've got it, you'll feel it. That's my experience. And money doesn't fix it. And it's like that, having the freedom of developing and supporting and caring and challenging and all them things that you can do within community around transformation. So I reckon it's a really deep question around self-determination, because it's a sovereignty question, but it's also a feeling and a spiritual part of you that you connect to that you've probably never experienced before. And from First Nation mob, I've actually experienced it. And I'll tell you what, money doesn't buy it. It's just having the know and the belief and the understanding and awareness that you can actually fix something and you can do it. And that's an experience that policies can't fix it. You can fight government, but if you really want solution, you really want transformation, you've got to connect to the people who are suffering and lead the way, and that's just my little understanding, but it's my authentic, and it's a part that I know that when I talk about self-determination, that's how I feel it and I sense it and how I articulate it. So I just wanted to share that. Yeah.
It's beautiful and very fitting that your organization, Dari Manwaro, means strong spirit, and to hear you speak about that, you can really feel it. Thank you, Hala.
No, it's so incredible, Alan, because I struggle with the concept of self-determination, and when the questions were offered, I went, because it fits within a Western human rights context, and it's shaped by a strong individualistic frame. And listening to you speak about community, about bringing forward voice, about spirit, kind of connects in a different way to making sense of it, you know, and because I think in and of itself, Western culture or Western education systems has limited our understanding. And so I appreciate your points, Alan. I don't have much more to add, but thank you for that. Yeah.
I might just add a little bit.
Hard one myself. Oh, sorry, didn't mean.
No, go on.
I think it's a hard one as well, because, you know, there is the two sides of it, of, you know, what you were saying, Alan, which is really people wanting a sense of belonging, and you can only get your sense of self of where you belong and where you come from, and then you've got your self-determination, which becomes this selfish singular momentum that you're moving forward on. So maybe it's somewhere that self-determination is, you know, feeling like you're thriving, but you can really only thrive when you find yourself, and that's within the community that you should belong to, and whatever shape that comes with. You know, not everybody feels that sense of belonging in the community that they were born into as well. A lot of people don't recognise and don't feel like they fit in that space. So for me, self-determination can be looked at in a very selfish way, but I think the word self has to come from that spiritual side, Alan. I think that's a really good point, is the fact of your sense of yourself is where you belong.
Yes, powerful words. I'm thinking about in some languages, Arabic being my first language, we can speak about ourselves in the collective. We can say, we missed you, I mean myself, but myself is embedded in a collective. Thank you for drawing that difference in understanding in the cultural context of how we use that language. Elizabeth, you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I think for me, as Alan was speaking, I think one thing that kept coming to me as you were speaking is this idea of like, it's really just about basic human dignity. That's what we're talking about. It's about restoring basic human dignity. And I think for me also similarly, I think as Tracy also shared, I struggle with it a little bit, because the question for me is always, who is determining what self-determination means? That's always the question for me. Because if it's coming from a place of human dignity, then it's ultimately in the hands of the people to make a decision as to what is the way forward. And I don't see a lot of that happening. I hear a lot of talk about self-determination, but there are boundaries and limits put to it. And that's not true self-determination, as you all know. So I think for me, that's where my struggle often sits, is like, well, there's power dynamics at play here that kind of are controlling, you know. So to what extent are we really allowing for people to determine for themselves? So I think for me, they're the questions that it raises, but ultimately I think it's about human dignity, and the more we center on that, the more we can arrive at a more meaningful, I guess, approach or solutions. I don't know.
There's grassroots movements, feminist movements in the States that I've been looking at and connecting with, and they prioritise self-determination over safety because of the points Elizabeth just made about the dignity and bringing forward your voice and connection. That doesn't mean they don't consider safety, but connecting to the people who they're serving and what matters to them, that's what they centralise in the work and the advocacy work that they do and support. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that raises, especially what you said then, Elizabeth, raises some really important questions for the things that you know, White Ribbon is trying to do, and other organisations. You know, you said the boundaries of self-determination. Who chooses that? How do you make sure dignity is upheld and choice all the way through? So when organisations want to collaborate with communities, how do we do that in a healthy way? How do we keep these concepts in mind through our partnerships, so that we don't encroach on, whether we use the word self-determination or even better, encroaching on dignity of others? How do we partner and collaborate in a healthy way is the underlying question there.
Can I just also add, I just think it was a really good question and probably triggered me. But one of the things I think about sovereignty, you know, being an oppressed, minority, but being proud of First Nation and the sovereign, we've invested a lot of time fighting government for our sovereignty, but there's something inside in our DNA that is our sovereignty in spirit. And it's like you've got to access that that spiritual part, which really gives you self-determination, because it's within, it's not external. And I think it's, because all the things being oppressed disconnects you. And it's like when you become out of that survival and into a, like Shana said about thriving, that's when you're really connecting to your sovereignty and your self-determination, because it's a sense of pride. Self-determination is a really spiritual thing, I think, and it's something that I'm not going to invest my whole life trying to fight government for sovereignty, because you might never get it. But you can walk around the streets, you can walk around shops, and you can feel proud, And I think that to me is real, having that self-worth and feeling proud of who you are and where you come from. That to me it's a deep word. It's a deep thing, but it's a personal thing too, And so thanks for asking. I love talking about self-determination and trying to learn about it. I think you're forever learning, evolving, listening, and like getting different perspectives. But it's interesting how that then works for other diversity. How do you see yourself in that? Because I'm really clear who I am, and I'm clear where I'm going. But how do you feel about you? Like, how do you feel about your self-determination or your sovereignty, or, So I think that's, if we'd have a better place if everyone connected to that. I think we'd have a more connective society and a more, rather than sort of being an oppressed, and looking for faults in each other, we'd be happy in our own skin. Anyway,
powerful words, Alan. Thank you.
Definitely. So how do we do it well when we're organizations like ours? How do we do this collaboration thing in a healthy way and partner in a healthy way, respecting all of those great things that we've heard so far?
I think that's a really big question, Brad, in the fact that how do we do that collectively coming together? And the word respect is definitely one of the biggest things, is respecting each other's rules and boundaries. And, we naturally have rules and boundaries in our own communities and our own sort of lifestyle. But I think, it might be really good for us to really be, I don't know, maybe put up some sort of ideals of what our boundaries are, what we expect people to respect of us when we're walking into someone else's community. And I think that's really important for me, from what I'm doing, because we're coming from an arts background and we're coming from communication in the arts. So for us to make it work with you and with the other organisations is for us to really get the experts from your area, and we work together and we sit and we listen to you, and then we collectively work together on that. So to me, I see what we do as singular projects is we merge for a while, that we sit and we get the information, and then we work with that message together to then put it out there to the general. Because the way I see we work together is that if we use the arts as the definitive sort of tipping point, is the fact that we can actually reach bigger communities and lots of other ones, because, family violence has a familiar thread no matter what culture and community that you work in. But if we can do that through the arts, telling your story, sitting with you as a singular, and then telling it to other communities, I sort of feel like then we could break down some barriers.
Thank you for that. I think, Shana, as you were talking, one thing that that really resonated with me with what you were saying is, in order to address, to create any meaningful change, we know the statistics can be staggering when we look at the research, and it can be easy to lose hope and go, oh my God, this problem is bigger than all of us. I think it's about recognizing the fact that ending men's violence against women, it's bigger than any one organization, firstly. And in order to create any kind of meaningful change, it really requires a collective effort at what we're able to do individually and where we can come together collectively is also brokering some of those partnerships as well. So I think when I think of the role of organizations like White Ribbon Australia and the Institute of Nonviolence, it's really about, I think, when you're working with communities, approaching it with a blank canvas and kind of not going, because I've seen a lot of the times organizations, and again, this is the boundary stuff that I was referring to earlier, organizations will approach communities to say, you know, we're wanting to address, you know, family violence in your community, but these are the boundaries that we're willing to work in. And it's almost creating a situation where it's still trying to get communities to conform to a particular narrative. And that's clearly not working. So I think that's one of the biggest things is organizations have to firstly approach communities to say, we're here to learn and we're here to be led by you to create sustainable approaches that are specifically responsive to your context and to your needs. And what does that look like and what does that mean? Because I think when we get better at doing that, we ultimately create more sustainable, you know, approaches that communities and communities drive that. And when you allow communities to drive the change, you actually create change. But when you go in with your own set of ideals and you say, we're here to help, but this is what we're here to do, well, that doesn't work. And clearly it hasn't worked because that's all we've ever been doing. And I mean, I hate to sound really negative. I know that there's been amazing, you know, initiatives, and I think some of the newer stuff that's coming out sort of in the last few years is definitely addressing that. But I think historically there's been a trend where communities have been not coerced, but kind of shifted towards certain solutions that haven't really, and it's just been a complete waste of money, a complete waste of resources and time. And then the bigger issue, which you know you can't really quantify, is the lack of trust that communities then develop towards organizations. Because they go, we know what this means. We've been consulted a million times. You know, you go and do a glossy report. We won't hear from you again. And that needs to change.
That was brilliant, Elizabeth, and everyone. Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to speak any more on this issue of how we collaborate well together before we move on to the next question?
No, well, I wanted to just add, I think, around and agreeing completely with Elizabeth, but that idea of how then we invert or give up power and how organisations can manage that or do that, rather than work within their timelines, their funding agreements, their regime, you know, and their systems, and then produce, and I've seen it, and I suppose we've all seen it over the years, the report that's, you know, shares the positives, but without much negatives, and you don't move much further, and people feel used, you know, and I think particularly in the men's leadership space where men have tried to challenge violence against women, it's become quite formulaic. And so finding ways of challenging yourselves, you know, challenging men who've got these monies and powers and positions to shift that, to step in and step away, like Alan said also, and learn. Like, how can you learn and consult? And consult doesn't mean it's up for debate. If there's accountability mechanisms, you listen to the community. Yeah.
I'll just add too, I think it's just the innovation and learning, because I think we can, when we have good, deep conversations, well, that's what the question was about. How do we get solutions? And I think that collaborative stuff and about sharing and not learning from each other, but just that whole thing around. I'm a big believer. If you don't change, if you do the same things, you get the same results. And if you change something, you become a bit more creative with stuff, you might see something different. So I love trying things. I think the thing is taking risks in situations around, you know, healthy risks, but just trying to challenge the norms, you know. And I'll tell you from our perspective, it's been really difficult to, I mean, I went to government, like even going to government, the institutionalised thinking, you know, like challenges people, like, you know, it's like any change or any challenge that can be confronting. And so, yeah, we hold on to things, and I think it's really hard. It's like trying to control situations and not open for possibilities. And think if we were a bit more open as you know, I mean, as I could imagine the diversity in this room right now, you know, and how deep we could go into the conversation. We've all got that common ground is we want to see good outcomes. We want connection. We want a good, healthy society and environments. But it takes a deep diving, I believe, to really unpack it and letting go of your egos and let go of trolls and all that thing. You just be open to possibilities of trying different things, you know, and I'm not afraid to try it, I can tell you, but because I know that I'll get different results, and it's a learning journey, and make mistakes along the way, you know, and that's okay too. You've got to be okay with that because you learn, you know. And so, yeah, I just, collaborative stuff. I love diversity. As I've got older, I'm really interested. I was just too busy trying to survive in my own world, and trying to survive and fix my own community and myself. But now, as I've got older, as you get mature, you start to be open, you know, you start to create, you become interested. And I think, geez, it'd be good if you could do that at an early age, eh?
Really feeling the passion in the group growing. It's definitely impacting me, and it's great to see. It's made me think this conversation about a small consultation report I did with the Victorian government last year, looking at, it was soon after COVID lockdown started, and there was concern about family violence spiking, and not much around perpetrators from multicultural communities. So I did a bit of a report on that Victoria wide, and I wasn't expecting to see great things, but I still was shocked by the amount of gaps and the things that came up through that research. And thankfully, Victorian government's picked that up and done more with it this year, which is great. But one thing that I did a lot of consultation with a lot of different groups, and including targeted cultural community groups. And as I mentioned earlier, I've been a bicultural worker, and I've worked in the migrant refugee space for a very long time as well. What I know from my experience and what we know from looking at the ground, and that bit of work I did last year really pointed to targeted cultural communities have so much experiential and relational resources in the way they work with their communities. And that helps them be more effective in the way they respond to the issues they're facing. But they so often lack sufficient financial and professional development resources that the larger organizations that tend to represent the dominant cultural communities of Australia tend to have. So how, because this is, we want to talk about solutions, what we're doing, good examples. How do we better share our resources, those resources that exist, both the relational, experiential expertise that is often undermined for the level of expertise that it is, and the materialistic resources? How do we share these things? And do you know any good examples of this happening?
I'm just interested even, Hala, in the idea of sharing, because I think why would mainstream organisations take the monies for migrant communities and for people of colour communities in the start and then want to share it? Because they're already holding power in the construction of that, in that contract. So if it's migrant organisations, I go, maybe they'll work out their ways in their communities, and that's for them to work out. I'm interested in mainstream organisations, and I get it that in the neoliberal climate and the way funding streams are set up, they're very purposefully marketed to big organisations with infrastructure. But then if that's the case and those organisations actually want to challenge power and respond to violence against women effectively at the local level, how do they give monies and negotiate differently and collaborate with communities rather than hold it? That might be very challenging at 8 o'clock at night, but I'll give it a go.
No, that's spot on, Tracy, because there isn't much sharing happening at that tangible, genuine sort of level. There, absolutely.
It's very negotiated, and it's 1 year, and it's contracted base, and there's expectations and, program logics and theory of change and models and output. And it's not how communities work. Local communities have knowledge and expertise. They just don't have leverage with governments, with funding sources. Yeah.
other panel
I
members?
think in terms of just thinking in terms of solutions, and I completely agree with you, Tracy. I think it's an interesting one, this question of sharing as well, because there's already an unequal power dynamic right there. But I think for me, what is really important is, and I've seen this happen at different levels, as communities start to organize themselves and advocate for their own needs, they're able to ultimately take back some of that power. I mean, it's a very slow process, as you've probably seen as well. But I feel like that is where we can create anything that's more meaningful, because you're right in saying that, you know, if community groups have to ask from bigger organizations for help, I mean, that's a very messed up situation to begin with, in my opinion. So I think it comes back to looking at what do communities have and how can they leverage that more, as you've said, to create a meaningful shift. And I really like, Alan, your earlier example about it being something that's quite intrinsic as well, that maybe it shouldn't is not the right word, but ideally it needs to come from it needs to be an internal thing. I think when the focus is too much externally, that creates a bit of a problem. And I think as communities get better, particularly with newer, I guess, newly arrived multicultural community groups, there's naturally that process where, you know, for the first kind of earlier years, it takes a bit of time for people to really organize themselves in those formal ways. But I've seen that as communities do that and learn how the system works, that community organizing creates a change. And I feel like that's where I feel like there's most hope. Not that people shouldn't share, I think people can and should, but it's ultimately then also up to these organizations who have the money to be able to share it, and whether they see the value in doing that, and do they do that in an equitable way, or is it like, you know, just providing, you know, very mean, you know, like, are they kind of just giving crumbs to organizations? But because I've also seen that happen where people get huge funding for community initiatives, they'll go and employ one person from a community and put a lot of pressure on that person, but there is also a broader lack of support as well. So it comes back to, I think, to the structural way of how we work, and how that is ultimately what needs to change, the systemic, you know, stuff.
I think that's really interesting, because that comes back to what got us started on Voice of Change at the beginning, is that we were trying to get information. We went to the police commissioner, we went to barristers and lawyers who work within the family violence sector, we went to principals, we went to community centres, and found that everybody that you went to had their own little issues there, and everybody's looking for funding and everybody's looking for the next bit. So everybody was holding on fast to what they had because they didn't want to lose that. And that's where I felt, and I don't have the answer, I'm just saying from my experience coming into it, is that everybody held on to their information tight, because it almost felt like a fear if they let it go, they would lose their funding. So what we're trying to do with Voice of Change is to speak to individual communities and organisations, so we can actually take some of your intel that you want to share, and we're bringing it together with our platform, so that we're hoping that we can get individual reports in a very very simplistic way to show people what's out there and what the beginnings are. But I do think it's a big problem. I think people aren't sharing because of the fear of losing their funding in the future. I don't have an answer, but I'm just coming in from my part, somebody that was wanting to bring everything together. It's actually a very hard thing to do, and the blocks have very spiky edges.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I was thinking about the whole thing around one of the things that I realised on the journey of healing and change and working with men around Victoria is I used to drive in my Commodore. I bought a $20,000 car off a CEO who used to run education, and it had gas in it. And so petrol and gas convert, I don't know if they make them these days, but I bought it and I thought, this car was one of the best resources I've ever bought. And what I realised is that it got me, I reckon I'd done about 600K or 600,000. I reckon I clocked it up to about 600,000. And I give it to my little cousin when it was his birthday, so I handed it down. I don't even know if he's got it anymore, but it meant a lot to me. And when you think about resources, and I used to drive along, I used to listen to radios and things, and I heard this wise thing one day, because I realised, you know, getting home at 2 o'clock and the risks that I took travelling from Melbourne to Mildura in this car, people wouldn't have employed me, you know. But I was just seeing, it was inspiring to see the outcomes and the feedback we got from supporting men. And I heard this thing, and it's probably a value that we carry within the First Nation community around sharing and caring. But and it comes back to values and as a society. But the most wisest thing, and it's I wanted to share this because it sits with me every time I think about resources. And one of the things I think about change and making a difference in community, you have to pay to do it. When you pay for something you love to do, you'll pay to do it. And so when I negotiate things and I don't get hooked on, you know, whether I get it or not, because I have this sense of belief that I'll do it anyway, whatever resources I've got. And I think if you come from that place, that is self-determination. And that is real change, because resources can be blockers and funding can be a blocker. So, you know, that's just something I wanted to share on, you know, in my experience, because we've grown and you do need resources. If you get them, great. And if you can share them, great. But it's like, when I think about that deep-seated value base around sharing and caring, I mean, it's in our DNA anyway, but it's something, when you find a passion and when you want to work in a space like family violence and making a change and a difference in community, you actually know when you love it because you'll pay to do it. That's how much you love it. And it was the wisest things I ever did. So that's my I suppose my little rant anyway.
Yeah, create the resources and find them where you can and use them to the best that you can.
Or is that all right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just it was Alan made me think of a small women's service in Dandenong in Melbourne, and Wellsprings for Women, and it's that commitment to doing the work because it matters to the women that, you know, that are vulnerable, that are marginalised, that are struggling, and they turn no one away, you know. And we were working out how to do what they wanted to do, but that was one of their bottom lines. They did not want to turn a woman away, so it didn't matter the money. Just what when Alan said that, it moved me, because that's the reality. Is you can do the work, you just got to do it. Yeah.
Would anyone like to jump in with anything else on that question?
It doesn't work for everyone. I mean, that's my, you know, some people need resources, some people love the money, some people need it. But it's interesting when you're so passionate in your community, which I am about mine, that's what drives me. And I think, you know, and seeing the results, but, you know, it depends. And I think that's when we're talking about violence and making a difference and a transformation, that's the place it's got to come from. And you're just so determined to make a difference, you will pay to do it, you know. And if you get resources, it's a bonus. And there's always a way, eh? But I think people see that and they feel that, and that's where I feel the best outcomes come from. You know, I think there's such a drive to make a difference. Is, you know, there is a sense of comes from within, you know, and there's that passion that switch goes on, and it's like, wow, you'll die. You'll spend your whole life in investment doing this work. You know, you wake up in the mornings and go to work because you love. I love coming to work. As soon as I go to bed, I can't wait to get to work. You know, I can't wait to get to work with the men. You know, when you're in that place, because you see it, and when you get grumpy and you're resentful and you're losing it, and you go, what am I trying for? It's too hard. All them sort of things that come, and them thoughts. they're like distractors, but you just know when you're in the right place, because that's what we need in this space. We need people with passion, and we need people with drive, and we need people to support families and make the difference in the women's space and men's space and children's space, and that's what's going to really create good change, I believe, from experience anyway.
Can I just add one more thing? I think also it's important to recognize the fact that the majority of the response to domestic and family violence is actually already within communities. Communities are the first responders. It's not funded external organizations. When somebody needs a place to stay, there's family members who step in, there's neighbors who step in, there's friends, there's people in other states that pull in resources and help a woman relocate. All this is community organizing that's already happening in the background. And I think it's largely not acknowledged as well. So I think your remarks, Alan, about the fact that, when you're passionate about something, you do help and you get it done. And I think also for people to recognize more and more that that's already happening. It may be largely unaccounted for, but it's happening. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind as well. And then how do we then further support people even more? Because there are people who are putting themselves on the front line and literally putting their lives at risk as well, and filling the gaps where organizations are not necessarily reaching. And that shouldn't be happening as common as it is happening, but I see it happening all the time. And I think that that's a broader conversation that needs to be had as well.
And I think that's perfect, because in the end, it is the community that's going to make a difference. Alan, before you were saying, we can't fight the policies, we can't fight everything all the time, because that takes a long time, but it is at the grassroots where we will see change, where we can make change, and where the biggest uprising will be. And I think that's the biggest thing of, people do put themselves on the line to help other people, but there's just as many people that would like to help but are too fearful and don't know and worried about the repercussions. So I think, learning on a grassroots level of how to work with this in this environment, in education, of, when you're seeing it happen, or when you want to sort of look at areas that are educating young kids of like what not to accept in the future, that can't just come from government and schools. It's got to come from the families and the community, and everybody changing their outlook within that. And I think self-perception, what we were talking about before, we've got to do it as a group. We've got to do it collectively, as families, as extended families, as communities, but also what we're talking about tonight of trying to share and connect with each other. It's, it's going to take a long time, but it can only make change if you make change within the community and make your changes there to make everyone else safer in that environment.
I think sustainability on programs too, Shana. One of the things I just quickly mentioned, I think the future is really important. The now, the past, but the future is important. And one of the things I want to think is about the sustainability of programs, and comes back to that self-determination and a lot of resourcing and to support what you need to get you through. And it's like this space here. We'll sell coffee, we sell food, we'll make a creative space just to fund and help support programs, because I find what I've seen, it's painful seeing community get funded for programs, and when government goes, oh no, we're not going to fund it no more, sorry, the program stops. I've seen so many good programs suffer. So how do you create, the driving community to fund these important, or in this important change, and it's the small things that matter too, because so I think a lot about that. That's the thing I think about at night. How are we going to make sure this program keeps going with selling some coffees or a bit of food? Because I know it's going to help in the long term. And if government decide to pull the pin, or there's a change of government, or there's people get mean-spirited, or programs stop. And so how do we, as we're making this transformation and change in community, how do we keep it going? So sustainability in programs are really important, because most programs are determined by government, you know, and so how, you know, that's that self-determination thing as well, about how do you sustain is a really important, you know, good change. So I just want to share that. That's the purpose of getting the space next door, is to hope people come in and it just keeps things going. I mean, that's what you do, eh? So I think, I don't know, I hope because we've invested in a lot of land, but it's a belief. It's a belief that people come in and support what you're doing and the purpose and intention of what we're trying to achieve, you know, and then we don't need government as much.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. We've heard a lot already tonight about even the act of sharing can be, or it has inherent power dynamics and power imbalances there. And so I'm also really interested in, I guess, when you're working within like a geographic area with different cultural communities, or for example, like where Shana works in the arts community, where there's definitely different levels of privilege and power, whether it's gender or color or other forms of power imbalance. So Shane, we're going to go to you first on this. How do you make sure when you're working with the arts community that all the voices are heard and that privilege is kind of accounted for in that conversation?
I think it's about making separate stories to start with. Is that, you know, we focus, it's one of those beliefs, if you try and tell everyone's story in one go, you tell nobody's story. So I think it's really important for us as, you know, arts programs and arts communication, is that we pick a story and we utilize that and use it within a certain background or a certain culture or a certain story. Behind the scenes, we can have as many different people behind it culturally working on it, because I think it's really important to make sure that everyone behind the scenes is quite diverse and works with each other. But I think the initial story will probably be more pinpointed towards one sort of subject within the family violence. But I think it's that sense of community behind the scenes is where you make a lot of difference as well, because, you know, we want to work with up and coming artists. We want to work with people that haven't worked in the industry before to be mentored through the process. And that way, behind the scenes, you're telling stories and creating community behind the scenes. And that's what we do with the movie, is it's not just the project that you put out there and what you see, it's how you work together behind the scenes. So I think there's two levels of how that is. But if we try and tell, each time we tell a story, we try and tell everyone's story, it will get diluted. So I think we get more strength by showing one specific story and making that really strong and put the proper communication that comes with that. And then we move to the next story.
Great. Thank you. Any other thoughts on how we make sure power is and privilege is accounted for when we're working like across cultures, or in, again, like a geographic area or a workplace, whatever it might be, a sporting club where there are a whole range of power dynamics? Any other thoughts on how we do that well?
I might add to what Shana was saying. I think I completely agree that there's, you know, that diversity of stories is really important. And I think a diversity of representation as well. People need to see themselves reflected, you know, as Shana said, in the stories that are being told, but also the people that are involved in these community initiatives need to come from a diversity of different backgrounds. Because you don't get that diversity of stories if you don't have a diversity of storytellers. So I think that that's a part of what needs to shift and change as well. So recognizing the fact that there are many different stories out there, but in order to get multiple viewpoints, we have to get multiple voices around the table. And I think community organizations can do more to drive that and to look at what are they doing to actually increase you know, diversity in terms of the stories that they're telling, but also in terms of who's a part of the initiatives that are being rolled out as well. Is there a specific cultural, you know, majority that is controlling the narrative? And if so, whose voices are missing and who's not around the table? And what can organizations actively then do to shift and change that? I think that's really important.
particularly I think and I guess it's obvious, like we keep naming this, I think that white male privilege, that it's institutionalized and it's systemic. So how do you flip that? What are the things you need to do? And part of it is, how do you pause and listen? And how do you step back? And how do you take advice and feedback and response deeply, to Alan's point, and reflexively? Yeah, how might you do that? And just one more thing, I guess, and I think I spoke about it earlier, that if we're doing this work and we're naming it as unjust to start off with, then if it's not a level playing field, how do you manage that? How do you not just name it and acknowledge it, but how do you, and what we've been doing at Shani Works, and we've been doing it with race workshops, but with also gender justice spaces, is how do men, in this instance, listen to women? Like, how do we set up the process? And we use caucusing processes or listening circles, but how do we do that where the people who've been subjected to the power actually get to direct for a moment in time? Just to pause. Yeah.
And so how do you do that, Tracy?
So we've used, and we learnt it, and I learnt it from Family Centre in the Lower Hutt, which is a New Zealand-based Maori and South Pacific Islander team of people with pakaha, but they had caucusing processes, and they set up caucusing processes based on culture and gender and sexuality, and depending on what the issue was, those who were in the dominant site within society paused and listened, and people from the marginalised space brought their issues and took time to explain it and explore it. And they would dialogue, because the dialogue's important, and then they would go away again. And sometimes the white people had to do more work, had to go learn, had to go listen differently. Yeah. But it comes back and forth, so it's not separate. It's still led, but it inverts the power purposefully and with structures and support.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thanks. Anyone else want to jump in on this? No? All right. Hala?
It's been a massive conversation, and I can't believe the time's just flown. But with 12 minutes to go, this is a bit of a free space for you to jump in with anything you think has been missing from the discussion tonight that you would like to add before we finish off, or if there's anything you'd like to ask of each other.
I've got one big one that I've been thinking about the whole way through. And I think that that's the role of education and community awareness. I think it's absolutely vital and necessary that more and more conversations happen in the community. I think normalizing talking about domestic and family violence is really necessary. I've seen in various, and I use the word communities very loosely, across a diversity of different communities that I've worked in, doing community awareness, even across schools, for example. There's still a lot of silence around domestic and family violence, and I think that's an issue. And I think there's also still a lot of shaming of people who are victimized by family violence. So I think that also needs to shift and change. And I believe that education, to use Mandela's quote, that education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. I truly believe that, because I remember a number of years ago, a workshop that I did with a local, it was a group of women doing English classes, and they had women from all different backgrounds. There was one elderly woman who came from my community, my culture, my background is South Sudanese. I was really surprised when she came up to me at the end of the workshop and she said, now that I have a better understanding through this, when we come together to have these discussions and do the family consultations, I'm going to suggest that once it's reached that point where he is not changing and he is not showing any sign of remorse or a commitment to change, I'm going to actively push that we call the police, because if the woman's life is at risk, I'm not going to be part of that conversation. And she is, as someone in her 80s, with a completely different viewpoint, because I know her personally, to be able to say that that's the power of community education and consciousness raising. So I think more conversations need to be had across all communities and normalizing talking about violence so that people who are subjected to domestic and family violence do not feel ashamed to speak up at the injustice that they've been subjected to. I think that's necessary.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Elizabeth. I think Others may want to speak to that as well, but one of the saddest things for me of the divide, if for the want of a better word, of mainstream organizations and multicultural communities is I hear a lot of communities have that's an Australian problem, or that's an Australian approach, that doesn't apply to us, we don't work that way, and that shuts down the conversation. So that kind of initiative and that drive to just have those conversations amongst the community can be so powerful. We really need to bridge that gap so that it's not, it just belongs to those communities. We started off by saying it's not unique to any one community.
Yeah.
How about other people?
I might just jump in because Elizabeth, you were saying like your biggest thing is about education, and I totally agree with that, because harm prevention before it gets to what we call the pointy end is about education of what you won't accept, but also what you won't do. And the overarching conversation of that we can't make change of domestic violence with men as the perpetrator if the men don't get educated, if they don't make a change, if they don't make a difference. And I think the biggest education that I've been learning and things that I've been part of is that the general public of how women are still talked about, put down in public, especially in the media. Like, that's something that I'm very big in the media, and I've come across it quite a few times where something could be said about a woman, but the men don't say anything, and it ends up being the woman having to justify them getting angry, standing up for themselves, and the men aren't supporting you. And I learned a very big lesson not long ago that there were quite a few men that wanted to jump in and say something, but they didn't know the words. They didn't have the language, and they were actually embarrassed how they acted. And I think it's really important in the education is, if men want to make change, we've got to give them some tools. And I'm not just talking about the men who are actually doing violence, it's the men that are the bystanders. I think the bystanders really need to step up, but a lot of people want to step up, but they don't have the tools. And that's something we're trying to work on with communities and with organisations as yourself. And I'd love to share some of your knowledge and what you do in your communities about those tools that we can give men, we can give people to stand up and say something and call it out, because we can't stop the shame if the victim has to be the one always saying enough. It has to be people around them that are very vocal to the person that's actually the perpetrator.
Can I just say, yeah, it's good, Elizabeth and Shane, and I think, I agree with Elizabeth around, to a certain degree, with the education, the intellect, but I also think, when you've come from an oppressive community and you're carrying truckloads of trauma, you can't intellectualize that. You've got to feel that. And so for me, for what works for us is to actually bring it up and talk about gut and heart stuff, and so that to me is a holistic approach. So I love working with the whole parts, not just the mind, because I think sometimes, we can sort of live in our heads and not in our hearts, and I think, so making it really safe for everybody, and particularly men, like Shona was saying, is giving them tools to actually feel and express, is a really important part that men have never. You often hear a young man growing up, and he falls over and gets hurt, and he gets shamed, don't cry, you girls cry, all them sort of messaging and messages that men get as young men as well. And so they learn to suppress feelings, they learn, but I'm talking intergenerational stuff, I'm talking truckloads, I'm talking generational, that we've suppressed through addictions, through violence, through all that sort of raging, acting out. And so that's oppressive. And that's a lot of cultures too. So, so if we look at the holistic approach around how we treat and how we work, it's, the mind and the awareness and things important, but it's the heart and gut is important. So it's getting all that balance and all them things in line that really make a difference, I believe. So yeah, so I just want to share that, because that's what I see where transformation happens. from my experience anyway.
Will I add a final comment, or are we running?
Yeah, no, Tracy, go for it.
I'm happy to pause if that's. I wanted to hold some of the words, and that this should be normal and normalised. And I think one of the pitfalls of the things we fall into is if we make this extraordinary, you know, men standing up or men speaking or men not being bystanders as something extraordinary, and that they're a champion. Doing justice work and gender justice and speaking up for women and connecting, you know, with respect and dignity should be what we'd be doing as people, you know, in the world. And so as whole people, as Alan said, like for our communities, because we just value people. And so one of my, I suppose the end thing is that doing just gender justice by men should not be a champion position. It should be every day. It should be just business as usual, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And that actually is a great way to wind it up. It should be business as usual. In fact, that's one reason we ended the ambassadors program with White Ribbon in the new chapter. Not because all of those ambassadors were doing it because they thought they were champions, but it definitely had in some instances created a sense of hierarchy or, you know, up on a pedestal situation. And so we're really committed to mobilising people, not just to be aware that men's violence and abuse is wrong, but to be personally and proactively involved in the change themselves, like you actually described at the beginning, Tracy, of this whole event, describing what it was like when small groups of men would get together and determined to be a part of the change. So it changed a lot about the way we're doing things in the new chapter. We're inviting people of all genders to become community partners, to reflect on themselves and their role in upholding or undermining the culture that creates the space for men's harassment and violence to thrive. As we've discussed, we're also you know, trying to get people to start community action groups to gather people in their communities and develop community-led ongoing plans to prevent men's violence and abuse. And we've launched the Community Response Fund that you might have heard of, but it's designed to actually put financial resources into community-led responses. And so we're hoping to learn from some of the things that you all shared tonight about how we do that in a way that addresses that inherent power dynamic and privilege that we've all been discussing. So please, if you're on this Zoom call, support, get involved with the Community Response Fund, or think about in your community starting a community-led response, community action group, because as we've all heard, it's going to take all of us to get involved to create a future where women and children are free from all forms of men's violence and abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, we just want to flag that if anything you've heard tonight has been confronting or difficult to sit with, or if you've experienced family violence, please call 1-800-RESPECT. If you're identify as a man and you've realized that you might be sometimes unsafe, or you know you've used violence or coercion in your relationships, please call the Men's Referral Service for support and advice. The numbers are in the chat. Just want to, on behalf of Brad and myself and the team at White Ribbon and the team at Institute of Nonviolence, thank everyone for joining us tonight. Special thank you to our panel members for the time you've given, your insights, sharing your stories and the work, the immensely valuable work that you do. Want to thank the team in the background that people can't see, Alan, Bryony, John, for the technical support. And again, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor for the Institute of Nonviolence to team up with White Ribbon Australia on this webinar. Really, the chat's been going off all night, so I feel like it's been valuable conversation, and extend my warmest wishes, and also for everyone who is locked down. I know not everybody is, and not even everyone on this chat, but for everyone who's in lockdown, take care of yourselves, extra warm, sending from lockdown to lockdown your way, because it has been a bit of a tough time for all of us, really. So thank you and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you to our panel.